It's pretty common for negative feelings and thoughts to get in the way of us achieving our goals. This could be when you try to work on a personal project that's meaningful for you. Maybe like you have all these ideas and this brainstorming and you're excited about like writing a novel, but then as soon as you start actually getting into concrete action, like, typing words on your keyboard, it becomes a lot harder. It could be when you have to take some actions that are scary or confess some information, maybe like asking for a raise or asking someone out. And sometimes strong feelings and doubts and, like anxious thoughts can also prevent us from focusing, just relaxing, or even just sleeping. Either just arise or they've been provoked by some previous event, or just because we are confronted with something of actually doing it, and then we get flooded with all these emotions, fear, anxiety, doubts, uncertainty, or just like negative self-talk about like how we're not good enough, or lots of formulated doubts like that. So what do we do when this happens? I think there's like generally two main ways or two default ways we tend to think about it, right? And it's kind of fight or flight. So either you just kind of give up because it's too scary or it's too much for you to handle, so you just do something else. That's usually what happens when you procrastinate. Or you kind of fight it, kind of push through it and you do it in spite of it. There's plenty of ways of thinking about this. There's like, feel the fear and do it anyway. And so I guess to an extent, that's kind of fighting it. And so in this video, I'd like to explore another option, which is about kind of learning to understand resistance better and kind of negotiating with it to reach a compromise or a solution that's more peaceful and more gratifying and also more sustainable over the long term. So I can take the personal example of my own creative journey, I guess, if we want to call it that, or content creation journey, where like I had the idea of starting a blog for years, and I kind of stalled and never did much progress because I was kind of stuck because of the resistance. I used the flight option and I just procrastinate, or I wasn't sure enough and I didn't know where to start. And I think there's like a couple of reasons for that. One thing that can impact this reaction is if you don't really have a solid enough reason for why you're doing something. So you don't really have motivation or a vision that helps you push through the uncomfortable feelings. This can come from clarifying why you're really doing something and what's kind of at the heart of it. And that kind of ties into ideas of like finding a direction for your life. And that's something I'm interested in, but we won't expand on that in this video too much. In my case, not that long ago, something around 2 years or maybe a little less, I started fleshing out more clearly what it was I was trying to do. Yeah, it became easier for me to actually commit to it. Some other forms of inspiration helped me too, like for example, and I would recommend it if you haven't, if you struggle with these types of issues and you haven't read it yet, but The War of Art by Steven Pressfield is kind of good to help inspire you. And it's really focused on this idea of fighting back against resistance, kind of not letting it influence you and just doing what you have to do anyway. So I think there's some value in kind of embracing this side of it. If you always give up in the face of resistance, then you won't really ever make progress on what matters to you, and then you feel disappointed about yourself, and that creates new negative emotions. So there's definitely some value into kind of pushing through and learning this kind of habit and way of thinking of kind of committing, and then you just do it whether you feel like it or not. And so that's how I started working consistently on my blog, and then I got better and better at it, like 1 year and a half or more ago. But then another kind of aspect that was weighing in my mind is that I've noticed in relationships that, or kind of in communicating with other people, that just antagonizing each other and just being very hostile, it doesn't really work super well. It's not as productive because it kind of just tends to escalate the conflict, and you don't rarely get at the core root of what's going on or why there's a problem, and so you can't really fix it properly. It's also unpleasant, at least for me. Like I don't really like open conflict, and so I kind of felt the same thing with this resistance, and I was kind of wondering, is there a better way to deal with it? So I had been inspired by nonviolent communication, for example. Another source of inspiration that helped me come up with this kind of idea for an alternative was internal family system, which is a a therapeutic model. Um, well, I won't get into the details. We'll cover some of the aspects, but you can read it. It's very interesting, and I'll probably talk about it in future videos too. But so yeah, basically I had a few issues with just fighting against resistance, or at least I felt like I was okay doing it as a temporary means, or like kind of because I don't really have any other way to make progress. But is there potentially a better way to do this? A way of thinking that's pretty core to me and my content is this idea that if you really understand what's going on, you'll have a better chance at solving the problems more productively. I made a video called Rigorous Inquiry, or about rigorous inquiry, and in general, that's just kind of a way I tend to think about things a lot. So I applied the same logic to resistance, and thanks to different frameworks, I started getting a better understanding of what's going on actually, and then that brings some new ideas on how to deal with it. One alternative to fight or flight that you'll find in some more, a spiritual or mindfulness advice is to sit with it. You just kind of, you don't react, you just observe it kind of calmly, and you just try to, yeah, kind of feel the emotion or the bodily sensation, and that's it. You don't really fight it. You don't run away. You just observe. And I think that's a good first step, and it's good to kind of if you can manage to get better at doing this as a reflex, then that's positive, and it will be needed for the next steps. If it's enough for you, well, good for you. But I kind of like to understand things in a more intellectual, or a kind of it makes sense. There's like A causes B that causes C, and therefore, if you change something, you can change the outcomes. And so I do think there are ways to actually kind of interface with the sources of your resistance. And I think so that's one first important thing, is understanding where does resistance come from and what is it. One way that it tends to be framed as, is this idea of the inner critic. That's more for your thoughts, that any negative, undermining verbal things you hear in your head, that tell you you're not good enough, or you don't know what you're doing, or this is a terrible idea, or nobody will like it, blah blah. I don't know. There's like a bajillion different things it could tell you, but so it's generally formulated as the inner critic. Usually, the idea is that you're in kind of a combative stance against your inner critic. You like different techniques, you just ignore them, dismiss them, maybe you fight back, or you insult them back, or or you just kind of exhaust them. One reason I'm not a big fan of the inner critic way of thinking about things is that one, it's antagonistic, and two, I think it's a little bit of a blurry concept. In reality, I think you can have different sources of resistance. So if you feel some strong emotions and thought that come up at a specific situation, you might have several different sources. So let's get to it. What is actually resistance? There's a different psychological model to understand this, but basically, I'd say they stem from maladaptive beliefs you form based on some experiences in your past, that some hurtful or traumatic experiences. And so there's different ways to think about that. In cognitive behavioral therapy, at least modeled by Beck, he calls those fundamental beliefs schemas. In IFS, so internal family systems, are called burdens, and they attach on parts. And so, the famous example that's usually given is you get bit by a dog when you're a kid, and now you've got this kind of phobic fear of dogs, right? And so it's kind of created this belief, or this, this subconscious belief that dogs are dangerous. So maybe anytime you see a dog, you start, getting a lot of anxiety. As I said, you can have more than one of these different beliefs, and you can have, there's a multiplicity to the way our minds work and what we want, which is also an idea in IFS. But you could have competing interests, right? So there's a part of you that might want to go pet the dog because you just like, you'd want to be able to do that. But then you've got this really fearful part of you that's very worried and kind of sending you all these signals not to do it. And so you're kind of conflicted. An important thing to take into consideration is that when these kind of beliefs form, it's usually you're pretty young, you're like a kid or a teenager, and this part of you, this kind of belief that's frozen in your subconscious, stays stuck in this kind of age frame, and so they're kind of you can kind of imagine them as like a child, and they're not very good at communicating. They have like concerns, and they just flood you with emotions and or negative self-talk, and they're not very good at communicating what they actually want from you, and they're not very good at being diplomatic. So they won't make a good and diplomatic and nice argument for why you might not want to do something, or you might want to take something into consideration. They'll just start flooding you with emotions or sensation, and kind of berate you with internal speech. So that's not very helpful. However, an important thing to take into account is that they actually have some valid concerns, and if you do take the time to try and understand what they're trying to get at, you can actually make some better decisions, and that's been my experience. As a note, I'm still kind of getting better at this. I've started training this new relationship with resistance, and I don't always do it, and I can get better. So I'm still learning too, but from my experiences so far, I think it's promising. And so I kind of wanted to share it with other people in hopes that it can help you too. One last important bit of info is that usually the thing why, and a reason why I think this alternative approach of coming to them with a certain level of curiosity and compassion is that when they are heard, usually when you kind of, they are sure that you did get the message we're trying to send, they tend to calm down and get more manageable. So the flood of thoughts or emotion kind of, tempers down. Maybe it doesn't totally diffuses, but there's less of it. Whereas if you kind of fight it back and you tell them that you don't care, then they kind of double down. They tend to be spurned, and it's kind of when you have an argument with a real person, if you're being very mean and you're not emphasizing at all with their position, it tends to escalate the tension. So now you have to work or do the scary thing you have to do, and you've got all this bubbling internal strife, and so it's not really helpful. If you can try to find a way to diffuse it before you have to start working, to an extent, at least a little bit, then that's better for you. So let's now get into how do we actually do this? How can we actually try to understand what's going on and diffuse the situation? So as a warning, these steps do take a little bit of time, so it's easier to put them into practice when you've got a little bit of time to kind of prepare or make some order inside yourself before you actually have to take an action. But the first step, and that works well for a lot of different things, especially if it's a lot of thoughts or a lot of different concerns, it can feel very overwhelming when you've got you've kind of got these elusive sense of like, oh, something's wrong. The first step, I'd say, is try to just do a brain dump. Write it down, either on a computer or on a piece of paper, and try to kind of have a list of all the different things you're concerned about, or you're afraid of, or strong sensations you have. So that's one first step that can be very helpful. Just putting it all down kind of helps have a clearer picture, see all of them at once, and just this simple step can help you make better decision and find a compromise that takes into consideration each different concern to find the best possible solution you can. I sometimes feel some strong resistance when I'm working on my blog posts. I know that one time when I was working on my post called What It Can Spark Isn't Always Bound by What It Is, I was kind of feeling a lot of different fears and concerns, and it was kind of hampering my writing. Right, every time I would try to write, I could push through it, but it was always there, and it wasn't really, it was kind of blocking me. It was making things harder. So I just decided, okay, I'm going to take a pause and just write down everything. In this instant, I didn't really need to go much further. I just kind of listed all the different concerns, and I was like, okay, let's take all of this into consideration and find the best compromise. It helped me find a better solution to kind of the way I organize my work, and it also actually unlocked a lot of inspiration on the moment. So it did help me, and after I had taken the time to clarify what was going on, it was a lot easier to keep working after that. I don't know if that's the case for everyone, but I know that for me, I tend to, well, we do have a limited working memory so basically the number of things that we can hold in our head at the same time. And so what will happen is usually if I don't put things down on paper or somewhere, I'll just have one concern in my head, and so I'll get fixated on that, and I'll try to find a solution. But then another one of my concern will now take its place, and because I didn't consider all of them, and so I just keep cycling through different solutions, and it never ends. And every time one of the concerns I'm not thinking about just comes back, and it's this endless cycle. So when you put everything down, you are as much as you can. Usually it helps. It really helps. The brain dump might have some limitation when you're feeling some strong emotions. And so in this case, it's good to take inspiration from the nonviolent communication framework to try to understand, to kind of identify what's going on by identifying the emotions and the needs that are behind your distress. There could be several feelings and several needs. Kind of try to find the different feelings associated with each, at least, clump or group of related needs. And so this, you'll get better at it with practice. One thing that can really help is to use the inventory sheets from Nonviolent Communication. They have a long list of feelings and a long list of needs. And if you're not very good at doing this naturally, like I'm not very good at doing this naturally, but if you take the time to read the feelings and the needs, and then it's easier to be like, oh, probably this. Sometimes just demonstrating that you understand the different concerns on an intellectual level is good enough, and then you'll be appeased. Sometimes once you've identified the emotions and needs, your resistance in you will feel like it's being heard, and that'll be enough to appease it. Sometimes it's not good enough. Now you've kind of found a compromise, but you still need to do a bit more of work. So this could be, on the one hand, kind of explaining why you're choosing this compromise and acknowledging that you're, some parts of you still feel fear, but kind of explaining why you're doing it gently, and then reassuring them and kind of soothing them a little bit, whichever way feels natural, or you can experiment a little bit. And I found that this works well in cases when you feel a lot of agitation within yourself. So I know that sometimes I can't fall asleep because something that happened previously, an event from my day is just like kind of stirred up a lot of emotions, and if I don't take the time to kind of sort through them, they're just bubbling under the surface, and then I can't sleep because it's kind of grabbing my attention. And so identifying what's going on sometimes isn't enough, and so you need to kind of do some reassurance and kind of understand your inner resistance and be kind of nice to it. So I just like to give a few caveats before I end the video. So just like pushing through resistance is something you kind of have to do again and again. This helps bring some more peace and understand what's going on. That's another benefit, is you kind of start understanding yourself better, and then you can kind of work on healing some parts of you instead of just kind of pushing through resistance you don't understand and start again and again without ever making really progress, except getting better at ignoring your negative emotions. But even if you do this, you use this approach of trying to understand your resistance and kind of being more compassionate with it, you'll still have to do it repeatedly. It'll still pop up again and again. But then you can kind of get more familiar, and then it gets easier to understand what's going on because you know that it's a specific part of you that's got a specific type of concern that tends to be very focused on certain needs you have and brings a certain type of emotions and bodily sensation. And so you get better at identifying what's going on. As I said, doing this takes more time than just kind of pushing through. So depending on the situation, if you're a bit short on time or you already know what's going on, or it's not super strong, you might still need to just push through and keep doing what you have to do. But in some instances, I think it's good to try and practice it, especially, for example, if you can't manage to fall asleep, and at this point you've got nothing better else to do than to try to resolve and appease your inner strife. As I said, it's kind of a long process of practice, and also just kind of making it a habit, because at the beginning it's very unnatural. I mean, for me, the natural, my natural proclivity is just to, like kind of run away and procrastinate. So then you build another reflex or another attitude of kind of doing it anyways, and then getting this habit of being like, let's stop, kind of fighting war against my resistance, but actually try to understand what's going on and maybe, having a more compassionate approach. But yeah, I'm getting better at it. It's been at least, I think, a year since I first started trying out this option. I think more than 1 year. But I'm progressively getting better at it, and it works surprisingly well, usually, when I actually take the time and remember to do it. So hopefully the same can apply to you. I mean, you can always just try, and if it doesn't work, you don't have to do it. But, something to consider. In conclusion, I'd like to reuse this metaphor of thinking about it as children to kind of drive home my point. But imagine you have a kid that's kind of having, a meltdown an emotional meltdown because something is not going their way. And they're very young, their brain isn't completely formed, they don't even know how to handle their emotion properly. So you can't really expect them to be like super diplomatic and tell you exactly what's not going right and coming at it from a very rational and tempered, uh, pragmatic way. On the other hand, you can't let the child get whatever they want and become a brat, and because sometimes what they want and they're upset about you is really important and necessary. But I think the better approach in this type of situation is not just to like smack them across the face and tell them just do what I say and I don't care about your opinion, and just kind of tyrannically kicking their ass. Instead, I think it's probably more productive and helpful to, be considerate of what they're going through, try to understand what the problem is, try to gently explain why you're still going to make the decision you have to make, because it's a responsible thing and you're the adult in the situation, and you have a broader view and you can understand the consequences of whatever is happening on the longer term. But you can be firm but gentle. I think you don't want to just let them have whatever they want in the case of children, because they don't, they're too young to really understand everything that's going on. And in the case of your resistance, it's kind of frozen into the past, and some of its concerns that were completely legitimate at the time when it happened are kind of overgrown now, and you're not in as much danger as you used to be, and so it doesn't make sense to have this much of a reaction, right? But yeah, I think that's kind of the general idea. You can be firm, but gentle, and kind of explain what's going on, and still, have some level of compassion. And I think it greases the wheel of your internal machinery, and it makes it easier to keep working in the future. And hopefully, my goal is to not have to deal with resistance at all if I can in the future. I mean, for the moment, I still have to practice, but hopefully, maybe there's a distant future, maybe not so distant, who knows, where I won't have to, push through as much resistance. And at least that's the goal. Let's see if I can do it. If I do, I'll keep you posted. But that's what I'd like to move towards.